The first thing I remember noticing was the stillness. You'd think it would be the noise or some dramatic reveal, but no. It was the unsettling quiet that wrapped around our neighborhood that day. My wife, Emily, had been acting off for months. Late nights, secretive texts, and the girls' nights out that didn't seem to involve many girls. Call me paranoid, but something didn't sit right. Still, nothing prepared me for that day. I'd forgotten my laptop charger at home and swung back to grab it, figuring I'd surprise Emily with lunch while I was at it. Her car was in the driveway, and a sleek black BMW, a car I didn't recognize, was parked just behind it. A bad feeling churned in my gut, but I told myself it was probably a contractor or maybe one of her coworkers. Rationalizing seemed easier than acknowledging the creeping doubt. I slipped through the back door. No need to startle anyone, or myself for that matter. Quiet as a cat, I walked toward the source of muffled voices coming from the living room. And there it was. Emily, my wife of 3 years, was tangled up with Mr. BMW in an act that made my stomach churn. The guy wasn't just anyone. It was Ben Godfrey, one of those old money types who wore his entitlement like a cologne. You know the type, pressed polo shirts, overly bright teeth, and the kind of arrogance that makes you want to punch them before they even say hello. I didn't barge in or scream. No, I stood there in stunned silence, watching my wife perform a show that would make an adult film star blush. My hands clenched, my chest burned, but my mind? It went into overdrive. I didn't have my phone, of course it was in the shop, and the idea of finding a camera was laughable given the circumstances. So, I improvised. While Emily and Ben were, let's say, distracted, I slipped into the garage. I grabbed a rubber mallet and waited behind a row of bushes near the driveway. The plan wasn't entirely clear, but the boiling rage needed an outlet. 5 minutes later, Ben came swaggering out, adjusting his belt and looking far too smug for a man who just cheated with another guy's wife. He knelt by his car, swearing at a flat tire he hadn't noticed earlier. That's when I struck, hard enough to knock him out, but not enough to kill him. I rifled through his pockets, found his car keys, and threw them into the nearest bushes like I was back on the high school baseball team. His wallet? Emptied of cash. He had a measly $24 on him, which felt like an insult, but I accepted it. His credit cards and ID? Thrown into a plastic bag that would soon end up in the trash. The hammer went back to the garage, wiped down with bleach, and I drove to my father-in-law's house. Why? Because we had an agreement to have dinner. I arrived 10 minutes early, as was expected. My father-in-law, Gordon Hastings, was the kind of man who valued punctuality over everything else, unless it involved his own family, of course. He tolerated me because I was a high-performing salesman at his insurance company, though he made no secret of thinking his daughter had married beneath her. "Where's Emily?" he asked, frowning as I walked through the door. "Good question," I replied, dialing her number from his landline. Emily answered after a few rings, her voice tight and panicked. "Blake? There's been a situation." "Situation? You mean the one in our living room, or something new?" "Blake, no. There's been a crime. A man was attacked in front of our house. The police are here. Wait, the officer wants to speak with you." A detective came on the line, calm but probing. "Mr. Bristol? This is Detective Burns. We're investigating an incident at your address. A man named Benjamin Godfrey was assaulted on your driveway and transported to the hospital. Do you know anything about this?" "Ben Godfrey." I feigned shock, ramping up the indignation. "He's my wife's ex-boyfriend. What the hell was he doing at my house?" "Your wife hasn't explained that yet." "Well, when you find out, let me know. In the meantime, tell whoever attacked him I owe them a beer." Burns didn't seem amused, but I didn't care. I ended the call, knowing full well it wouldn't be the last conversation I'd have with the police. Hanging up, I turned to Gordon, whose face was a mix of confusion and growing anger. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. "Your daughter's screwing her ex," I said, grabbing a glass of his expensive bourbon. "And I'm divorcing her." Gordon's reaction was priceless, a mixture of sputtering indignation and the dawning realization that his perfect daughter wasn't so perfect. He started yelling, something about how I was disrespecting his family, but I just sat back, sipping his overpriced bourbon like it was a cheap beer. "I think we're done here, Gordon," I said, placing the empty glass on his pristine marble counter. "Oh, and you might want to have a word with your darling Emily about fidelity. Or better yet, get her a subscription to one of those dating apps. She's already halfway there." I left him standing in the kitchen, red-faced and stunned. As I walked to my car, I realized two things. One, I was officially unemployed because Gordon would no doubt fire me first thing Monday. And two, I needed a lawyer. But not just any lawyer. I needed Ron. Ron Botts was an old friend from my middle-class roots. The kind of guy who could take a punch in a bar fight and still have the presence of mind to call the cops on you. He was sharp, ruthless, and didn't give a damn about decorum. Perfect for what I had in mind. By the time I got to a motel for the night, I was on the phone with Ron, explaining the situation. "So she cheated on you with some trust fund douchebag, and her dad's about to kick you to the curb," he summarized, laughing darkly. "Sounds like you've got yourself a country song, Blake." "I'm not looking for a soundtrack, Ron. I need to know my options." "The prenup." "Ah, the prenup. Still got a copy?" "Of course." "Good. If she cheated, you're entitled to a payout. Did you get proof?" I hesitated. "Not exactly. I caught them in the act but didn't have a phone or camera." Ron sighed. "Classic rookie move. But all's not lost. We can still make this work. Lay low for now, don't do anything stupid, and definitely don't go back to the house alone. We'll play this smart." The next morning, I met Ron at his office. We pored over the prenup and discussed the plan. First of all, file for divorce on grounds of adultery. Secondly, gather evidence, even if it was circumstantial. Thirdly, get ahead of any countermoves Emily or her lawyer might try. "You need to be squeaky clean," Ron warned. "No funny business. The judge will crucify you if you look even remotely shady." He handed me a burner phone and set up a meeting with a private investigator. That afternoon, I returned to the house with the PI, a grizzled guy named Hank who looked like he'd been born suspicious. I made sure Emily wasn't home, her car wasn't in the driveway, and she hadn't answered my calls. While I packed a few essentials, Hank installed a voice-activated recorder in the kitchen. "This baby'll pick up anything within 20 feet, he said, adjusting the settings. "You'd be surprised what people let slip when they think they're alone." True to form, Emily didn't disappoint. The next day, Hank played me a recording of Emily talking to her friend, Lydia, about how to stage evidence of abuse. The plan was laughably bad. Lydia would punch Emily a few times and make some small cuts to prove I'd been violent. Then they'd go to an urgent care clinic to document the injuries. "People really think this works?" I asked Hank, shaking my head. "You'd be amazed," he replied, smirking. "But don't worry. This'll sink her." The recording, combined with the circumstantial evidence Ron had already collected, gave us the upper hand. By Monday morning, divorce papers were filed, and Emily was served at her yoga class. Predictably, Emily countered with a claim of domestic abuse. Her lawyer, Amanda McAfee, was a hard-nosed attorney who specialized in playing dirty. The allegations included everything from verbal threats to physical violence, all conveniently unsupported by any real evidence. Ron and I weren't worried. "We'll let her hang herself," Ron said, grinning. "Give her just enough rope and see what she does with it." Lydia's deposition was scheduled for the following week. She arrived looking nervous, her eyes darting around the room like a trapped animal. Ron started off with polite questions, easing her into a false sense of security. Then he dropped the hammer. "So, Miss Castle, you're certain the injuries were caused by Mr. Bristol?" "Yes," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. "You're also certain that you didn't inflict those injuries yourself?" Lydia's face paled. "Of course not." Ron pressed play on the recording. The room went silent as Emily and Lydia's voices filled the air, detailing their little scheme. Lydia's face turned beet red, and Amanda McAfee looked like she'd just swallowed a lemon. "Would you like to amend your statement?" Ron asked, his tone calm but menacing. Lydia burst into tears. The fallout was immediate. Amanda withdrew the countersuit for abuse, and Emily's credibility was in shambles. With Emily's abuse claims dismantled, the trial shifted focus back to the divorce and the prenup. The judge presiding over the case, a a young and polished man named Judge Matthew Collier, seemed to have a soft spot for Emily, or maybe for her father, Gordon. It didn't take a genius to see that the Hastings name carried weight in the courtroom. But Ron wasn't intimidated. If anything, Collier's favoritism just made him more determined to crush Emily's case. The first day of trial was brutal. Emily played the victim like a seasoned actress, her tears flowing on command as she recounted our happy marriage and how I'd supposedly grown cold and distant over the years. She painted herself as the loving wife who couldn't understand why her husband suddenly wanted to tear their life apart. I'll admit, she was good. Even I almost believed her. But Ron? He was better. When it was his turn to cross-examine, he dismantled her sob story piece by piece. He brought up her frequent absences, the suspicious spending on her credit card, and the recording of her conspiring with Lydia. Mrs. Bristol, Ron began, leaning casually against the witness stand, you testified earlier that you've always been faithful to your husband. Is that correct? Yes, Emily said, her voice trembling. Let's talk about Benjamin Godfrey, Ron continued. When did you first reconnect with him? Emily hesitated. We bumped into each other at a charity event a few months ago. And you just happened to bump into him again, naked, on your living room sofa? Ron's tone was conversational, almost friendly. Emily's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The real fireworks started on the second day of trial. Ron called Dan Drake, a private investigator and, as it turned out, a man with a knack for capturing incriminating footage. Drake testified about his investigation, explaining how he'd been hired by one of Emily's former acquaintances to document her infidelities. Then he dropped the bombshell, a video of Emily having sex with another man while we were still married. Your Honor, Ron said, addressing the judge, I'd like to present Exhibit A, a recording authenticated by Mr. Drake. The courtroom fell silent as the video played on a small monitor. It was unmistakably Emily, passionately entangled with someone who was very much not me. Emily's face turned ghostly white, and her lawyer looked like she wanted to disappear. Mrs. Bristol, Ron said, pausing the video, can you identify yourself in this footage? Emily stammered, it's not me. That's a fake. Really? Ron's voice was full of sarcasm. Because Mr. Drake is willing to testify under oath, and we can bring in an expert. Judge Collier looked deeply uncomfortable, but he had no choice but to allow the evidence. During a recess, Judge Collier summoned the attorneys and both parties into his chambers. He looked visibly rattled, his professional facade cracking under the weight of the scandal unfolding in his courtroom. Mrs. Bristol, he said, fixing Emily with a stern glare, this video strongly suggests that you've committed perjury. If this case proceeds, I may be obligated to refer the matter to the district attorney. Emily's lawyer jumped in, trying to salvage what she could. Your Honor, we'd like to request a settlement discussion before proceeding further. Ron smirked but said nothing. By the end of the day, Emily had caved. She agreed to pay me the $500,000 stipulated in the prenup, plus an additional 10% of our shared assets. Her father even stepped in to cover her legal fees and the interest I demanded for the delays. The case was settled, and the records were sealed at Emily's insistence. I didn't care, I had my money, my freedom, and the satisfaction of watching her squirm. The fallout was swift. Emily became a social pariah, her reputation irreparably damaged. Gordon Hastings tried to save face by offering me my old job back at double the salary, but I declined. Instead, I joined his biggest competitor and systematically poached his clients, including some of his most lucrative accounts. As for me, I moved into a new place, focused on my career, and rediscovered what life was like without the constant stress of a deceitful partner. Emily's life, meanwhile, continued its downward spiral. Revenge, as they say, is a dish best served cold. And in this case, it was absolutely delicious.